Okay, we are going to start in a few minutes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, well, I think we're ready to start. Thanks for sticking around, everybody. Maybe a few more folks will trickle in. But like I said, we just wanted to have a chance in the midst of all these special services and holy days to talk about what they might mean to us. And I think Sarah and I, we were talking this week, we imagined we might talk for, 15, 20 minutes. We'll see how it goes. And then open it up to comments and questions for you all. Did you want to start us off? Or?
Yeah, and I just also wanted to shout out Dell Welsh online. And I don't see her in here, and so I'm hoping she either drops in or watches the recording. The idea for this conversation came out of apparently a small group conversation, a small group here at First Parish who were saying, what do our ministers think about the resurrection? I'm curious, what do they believe, And so they brought that to us through Dell, and so this sort of came out of that. We're going to talk about what these days mean to us and, as ministers, and then kind of open up for conversation around what does it mean to you? What questions do you have, and what might they mean for us collectively? So just jumping in, really one of the beautiful things about I think the whole sacred story is that it really is a reflection of the fact that we as human beings are a storytelling people. It's like the most ancient and most one of the most human things you can do is to tell somebody else a story. And that's what we find ourselves dropping into, as we found this morning with this sermon. It's these ancient stories that communities of faith have told again and again and again to reflect the ways that they have connected and experienced the divine, to reflect the ways that they come together as community and to make meaning and to think about what it is that we're really, doing here in the world. And so that sort of approach to theology, one might say, could be called a narrative theology. These are, we're not approaching these stories as, is this factual and what date did this literally happen, although those are conversations that you can have because a lot of these things are rooted in some sort of historical moment. But when you do theology from a place of narrative, it's a reflection of, we make meaning by telling stories together, and the biblical story is exactly that. It's a collection of narratives. And when we act them out like we just did this morning through this processional. We retell them, we reenact them for today, and then it forces us to ask that question. So then, which parade am I participating in? And that's the nature of narrative theology, and that's the nature of what Holy Week is. It's a story of the last week of the life of Jesus.
Yeah, I remember when I was, some of you know I didn't grow up going to church, so I really got into it in college. By the end of college, I was reading a lot of theology books, thinking about, divinity school, and then thinking too about whether I wanted to become an academic and write long papers about this kind of stuff, or as slowly became clear that I was being called to parish ministry, and what you get to do in a church in terms of the kinds of theology we get to explore. And it's funny, I don't even know if folks in the pews necessarily think of it like that, but I think some of you do. We are doing theology. We are performing statements and descriptions of the divine every single week in what we do here. And I was really drawn, as someone who is a writer and sort of came to this whole thing of church through literature and poetry, I was really drawn to this particular mode of theology, and the way in which in church kind of we get to play it out, and the style, right, is so important. In poetry, I think there's this sense that, there's no separation between what you're saying and the way you're saying it. In poetry, that's the same, right? You can't just translate a poem into a newspaper article or a science report. How you say it is what you're saying. And when I think about the Gospels and moments like the story of the road to Emmaus, when some folks are talking with Jesus and they don't realize who it is, and then after he leaves, they say, "Weren't our hearts burning within us?" Or something like that. And that feeling, right, to me is so poetic. And next week, Kit's going to preach on Easter about this moment in, I think it's Matthew, where Jesus appears after his death, and it's described as Jesus being like lightning. And so these words and these phrases are everything in terms of how we take in this story. I'm much more interested in that than yes or no, it happened or it didn't happen. I believe in the resurrection, I don't believe in it. To me, over the years, it's much more about the way we talk about it and the words and the images that are used. I also think about the first time I read the Gospel of Mark, which you might know is the shortest, earliest gospel, most blunt. It's actually the least literary, but it ends, the original version, it ends with, in English at least, and they were afraid. They were afraid. It ends with this moment of just fear and not knowing what was next, and that kind of awe and terror and wonder all wrapped up in one. So when I think about how we do justice to what we read in the Gospels, as a living, breathing congregation, it is about how we tell the stories, and we do that in our sermons and in our little attempts at a procession today. So yeah, that creativity, I think, is at the heart of it, right?
I think we were just going to quickly touch on Holy Week as like an arc, just like what is Holy Week, and then we were going to zoom in on Good Friday and Easter and the resurrection. But I also heard a request, so during Q&A we'll also talk about Maundy Thursday. So Holy Week, it's this trajectory of the last week of Jesus' life and all the stories leading up to that culmination of Good Friday and the burial on Holy Saturday and then Easter Sunday. So you might not know it, but there are many traditions around the world in the Christian tradition that actually have something every single day that marks the events of that last week as the story unfolds in these narratives in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they are told differently in the different Gospels. But today we have this processional Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We don't typically maybe know of or practice in many of our traditions, but some of you might be familiar. There's Monday, which recognizes the day that Jesus went in and overturned the tables in the temple. Tuesday recognizes some of his final teachings. Wednesday recognizes that and observes the day of Jesus being betrayed and the plot against him by Judas. Thursday is that Last Supper of Maundy Thursday, where he gathers with his disciples and washes their feet and gives those final teachings. Briefly, I will say that word Maundy, what does that word mean? It comes from the word commandment, and it's rooted in that final command of Jesus. Love as I have loved, that you may love one another. This is my final commandment. And so that's where that root comes from. And it's Jesus' final moments with his disciples where they are in community together and he washes their feet and he serves them. And oftentimes churches will gather and have some sort of communion service as well. Sometimes churches will have foot washing rituals. Some congregations that I have been a part of have done the foot washing rituals, and I have washed parishioners' feet before, so that was...
Has anybody else done the foot washing? I did it once in Chicago. Okay. Little beginnings of a group here.
Yeah. And then, of course, we are probably most familiar with Good Friday, being the day that we commemorate the day that Jesus was crucified. More on that in a moment. And then Holy Saturday. I don't know if anybody is familiar with Holy Saturday or remembers. Back in 2020, Rosemary Lloyd and I did because we were all online at the time, right? It was the first couple months of this global pandemic, and everything had shut down, and we said, well, what are we going to do for Holy Week? We did an online retreat, Holy Saturday retreat, Holy Saturday morning, and Holy Saturday commemorates the day of Jesus being buried, or the time in between that incredible loss, that incredible suffering, and just the disciples being in this limbo, not knowing that Easter was coming. We're in this point in the narrative of this incredible loss, this incredible trauma, this devastation has just happened, and here we are and in this uncertainty of what does it mean to sit in this loss and not know what is going to come of it, not know what is going to come of us. And so that is Holy Saturday, just commemorating the burial. And then, of course, we have Easter Sunday. So that's the arc, and we'll zoom in, like I said, more on those two particular days.
One challenge that sometimes ministers feel is, we get a bigger crowd on Palm Sunday, and then, the next time we see a lot of people is not till Easter. So how do we kind of honor everything that Sarah just described as happening in between? So I think one thing I was trying to do a little bit towards the end of my sermon was just change the mood a little bit more towards that Good Friday, that Holy Saturday kind of moment, which to me is so necessary to experiencing what Easter is all about, right? The joy and the surprise that we get on Easter, it feels like it has to be earned in some way, or it means so much more when you go through all the feelings of especially Good Friday, which I think we want to delve into a little bit now. Sarah and I were talking this week, and I think I told you, like, to me, Good Friday is such an important part of the Christian story, and I guess my own faith, right? It's hard to imagine my faith without it. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that the real sense of Jesus, I guess, first being betrayed by people who are close to him, but then even more strongly than that, Jesus feeling that God wasn't there. That for someone who had lived and felt so close to God, in a moment of need, to feel God's absence so profoundly. And I think we get that especially with that moment on the cross where he quotes a psalm and says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Quoting poetry, right? It's like he goes to poetry at this place of deepest need. And so, I always, having not grown up in church, I still feel sometimes weird about my whole life. And also as even describing myself as a person of faith. But it's like, if faith includes this, if our story includes this moment where there is complete abandonment, and if that's allowed to be part of the circle, then I'm interested, right?
Having grown up in a different sort of context where, the crucifixion of Jesus and the resurrection were so integral to my faith. I grew up in an evangelical context, and the idea that it literally happened and it literally had this particular meaning was so integral. And so when I got to a place of questioning that, I then had to reckon with, so then what does it mean? Because I no longer see it as this divine payment on behalf of sins in order to get me a ticket into heaven. And so what is this? And something that one of the tensions that I often have with, people from the tradition that I come from, the people will often ask me, so then why did Jesus die if not for your sins? And I say, Jesus didn't have to die. Like, that's exactly the point, is that it didn't have to happen, but it happened because this is an example of what human beings do to one another. This is an example of what the human experience can and often be like, and often is like, whether it's suffering we inflict on one another or just suffering that comes as a result of just the ebbs and flows of life. The depth of that trauma is something that we all experience, and we all experience some sort of questioning in that moment. And so for me, Good Friday, when I came and circled back around to it, it still is one of the most integral and one of the most necessary parts of my faith. Good Friday. Without Good Friday, I don't really know why I would be a Christian anymore. And the reason why it is still so central is because I see it as a story about how God becomes in solidarity and takes on the suffering of humanity to the point that God's self is willing to be abandoned and die, and to experience that, all of the ebbs and flows of life, and to be a crucified one. And so to be a follower of that kind of God means to be a follower of and to be in solidarity with the crucified peoples of history.
One book that we didn't talk about this week, but that I was thinking about, is The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, a black theologian who draws parallels, just as Sarah was talking about, between the crucifixion of Jesus and, the experiences that black leaders have had over and over and over again in our country. Did you study with him? Was he there?
I did, actually.
Yeah.
So James Cone was the kind of seen as the father of Black theology or Black liberation theology in the 60s and 70s, and he was a professor at Union Theological Seminary that I am an alum of, and so I took his final Intro to Theology class at Union Theological Seminary before he died very sadly of cancer in 2018. And that, I would say, is one of the most formative parts of my spirituality, and like I said, the reason I am still a Christian is if God is with the crucified peoples of history, if that's what the story is actually about, then that's my call, to be present there in that place as well. Recognizing that suffering that I go through in my body is something that the divine has experienced also, and also the suffering of the oppressed today, that's where God shows up, and that's where I'm called to be as well.
Just reflecting on how intense the story is too, I think that's something that's a challenge for me. Obviously, professionally, I have to be here on Good Friday, but can I muster the kind of emotional and imagination required to really enter the story? And I wonder if people feel like that's a challenge for all of us. Sometimes we go about our daily lives, we try to fit in these really important days into our schedule, and sometimes you show up and it really connects, and then other times maybe your mind's on something else. But I think about when I think about what I like about Christianity, which obviously there's a lot to question, but I think about the courage of the intensity that these days require. I'm particularly thinking of Good Friday and Easter. The real intensity that's required to join the story at the moment that it's at. There's that great quote from Annie Dillard about coming to church, that we shouldn't put on our Sunday best to come to church, but we should be wearing like hard hats, because it's serious, it's intense stuff. And so we think about how to bring that to bring that here in a way that honors where everybody's coming from, but doesn't shy away from in the case of Good Friday, the real pain and abjection of the story. Anything else we want to say about Good Friday before we get to Easter?
We can turn to Easter.
Yeah, I think obviously they're bookends, right? Good Friday and Easter, they're sort of opposites in some way. I think what's demanded of us on Good Friday is sort of as hard to summon as what Easter demands, in a really different way. When we were talking this week, so Sarah and I think we come from such different places, right? But I think we've come to share a lot in common about what, how we want to talk about Easter, and how we want to talk about the resurrection. Please jump in. But we were saying this week that whenever we get asked, like, "Oh, do you really believe this?" And I've had ministers ask me that too. I mean, the number of UCC ministers who will just say they don't believe in the resurrection is quite high. So So I've been part of those conversations. I don't mind it, but it does feel a little bit inadequate to the story, right? And this is where we go back to the sort of narrative theology, the creativity inherent in trying to appreciate the way that these things were described. And so to me, it's more about how was it described? How did it feel? And what kind of life does it suggest for us, right? What kinds of changes does it suggest for us in our lives? I want to sort of go towards the connection with social justice, but do you have anything first to say?
Yeah, I would just add that how does it feel, for me, is a very embodied thing, that this is a story about bodies from beginning to end. If we look not just at the narrative arc of Holy Week, but of the entire Jesus story, and think about it as the divine is in some mysterious way moving towards humanity. We think about it in the doctrine of like incarnation, like the divine took on flesh and dwelt among us, made God's dwelling amongst us. That's something that is it's repeated often throughout the whole narrative of Jesus' life, of the importance and the centrality and the holiness, the sacredness of bodies. And so when we get to the end, it's this suffering of Jesus' body, and then we get to this final moment of resurrection, and this move that I hear so often people then make at the very tail end to say, well, we think about resurrection in more of a spiritual way as opposed to a physical resurrection, which I don't quite understand that split. And I don't think that the original audience would have understood it either, that the spiritual is physical and the physical is spiritual, and that's kind of the whole point of the narrative of how enmeshed those two things are, that our bodies are sacred. This world is God's world, and God is moving towards it, not away from it. And so for me, coming back to this is a narrative, it really is an abandonment of the narrative at the very end. If you just in order to like preserve some sort of like intellectual, questioning that we have, which is natural and understandable given the content of this story, to just make that move and then say, but it was some sort of spiritual, or it's a metaphor. For me, I'm not. I have left one tradition that it was so important that it was literal, right? How many apologetics classes did I take where I studied arguments in defense of the literal resurrection of Jesus? I taught those classes. I could do a whole case right now for the resurrection of Jesus Christ based off of these arguments that I was trained in. And I left that behind because that's not satisfying, and I think that misses the point. But I also think that final move of, well, I don't believe in the resurrection, so how do I interpret it metaphorically? For me, also doesn't feel satisfying, and it feels like it dishonors the narrative. So I'm much more interested in saying, so what if we tell the story the way that the story's been told, and ask, so then what does that imply about our world today? If God is constantly moving towards embodiment, not abandoning it, that after that final suffering on the cross, God did not abandon this world, bombs and guns and crosses don't have the final say. There's actually the suffering of the past and the physicality of the future. It's all bound up together, and we can still experience the divine here in this flesh and this scarred body. That's to me what the resurrection is. And so it's really important to not abandon the body, because I think that point of the resurrection is that God doesn't abandon us.
I love that emphasis on the physicality. And the fact is, this is a hard story to believe, right? It takes work. In a way, the fundamentalist inclination to prove it as a historical fact kind of repeats the secular rationalist, inclination to totally dismiss it, right? They're both kind of approaching the story from opposite ends, but like missing the good stuff, missing the life-changing possibilities. And to me, something about the strangeness and the irrationality of it is what I want to preserve, right? And we're never going to get up on Easter Sunday and preach a sermon that convinces people, I don't think. But I think it's about doing honor to the strangeness and the surprise of it. And I suppose in people's lives, opening up a little bit of space for that possibility. Because I think our wider world, we're so focused on money in certain ways, so focused on rationality, and there's not a ton of space for that in our culture. I know we want to throw it open to questions soon. Let me just make one more link, if that's okay. One thing we talked about this week too was the sort of surprising connection for some people, and especially people of our generation, who are pretty progressive in terms of social justice, really interested in the activist side of the church, but are also insistent on the resurrection as being this physical event, right? Not wanting to wash it away, not wanting to claim it was metaphor. And I just want to remind people of that tradition of a sort of more, if you want to say more orthodox theology, living with a progressive politics. That has been essential to certain important changes that have happened in our country, whether it's abolition, right? Those abolitionist ministers who moved out to the Midwest, who went to fight in Kansas, like they really believed in Jesus. Likewise, the civil rights movement, some of the suffragist movement, and then, of course, a lot of the church that stood up against Hitler in Germany, right? There was the liberal wing of the German church. They mostly capitulated. When I say liberal, I mean liberal theologically. They mostly capitulated. The branch of the church in Germany that stood up was people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They were called the Confessing Church, and they were much more orthodox theologically. So I just think that's a good thing for us to remember, because I think sometimes we conflate liberal theology with liberal politics, if you will, and they don't always map out in the same way. And so that's just sort of a trend for us to be aware of in the present day as we think about these really hard things, such as Good Friday and Easter. Anything else to add? Yeah. So we'd love to hear from all of you. Thank you for listening to us yammer on.
Thanks. That was such a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate it. One of the things I wonder about that didn't come up here was the question of Jesus as Son of God, right? Begotten, not made, right? And the whole Holy Trinity and all that. I'm just curious what you guys are thinking about that and how that ties in.
You get to answer first. You're sitting up there.
All right. Well, I hesitate to say it in this wonderfully big tent, theologically big tent context, but personally, I find myself still deeply compelled by a Trinitarian perspective of the divine, this idea that the divine exists in ongoing community. And I find myself personally, I meet God in Jesus and in the story of Jesus. That's not everybody's experience, and we've got this big tent, but part of, this point of this conversation is for us to talk about us as ministers, and that's kind of where I'm at. How do I make sense of it? So one doctrine that you might find interesting or compelling to think about is the doctrine of the universal Christ or the cosmic Christ. It's a book by Richard Rohr. It's the idea that the divine is existing in eternal community, and that the person of Jesus represented or held that universal divine spark, that God spark, for a little while, but that's not exclusive to him, but that's something that we all have access to and all embody in different ways in different times throughout history, and all actually the universe embodies that divine spark. That's another way of thinking also about process theology, that all of the material world holds that divine spark, and I'm very moved by, like I said, the idea that the physical and the spiritual are deeply intertwined and we can't ever separate them. And so that universal Christ is not limited to this one historical figure from 2,000 years ago, that same spirit is present in all things, in all times, in all places. The reason why I still find the Jesus story particularly compelling is I like the idea of God being universal and particular, and the idea that God shows up in our unique particularities. I think the particularity of what does it mean to tell a story about God taking on human form as a man of color under colonial occupation who experiences state violence and is executed by the state. To tell the story about God showing up in that particular body has implications for how I show up today in my world. And so it's that narrative, the divine being enfleshed in this man of Jesus. A couple things about Son of God and Lord. Those are would have been very stark political statements for the time. For people at that time, when they heard somebody saying Jesus is Lord or Jesus is the Son of God, what they would have understood that to mean is Caesar is not the Son of God. Son of God was one of the titles for Caesar. Caesar is Lord was printed on their currency, right? So it's to say Jesus is Lord is to say Caesar's not Lord. And so those are titles that are, that part of the stories that are being ascribed to this person. What then does that invite us to think about in our moment of empire? To say, what does it mean to say the one who came in on the colt is actually where the power is, not the one who came in on the war horse?
I don't think I have anything to add to that, Andy. That was an amazing answer. Christina, did you have a question?
So I may have come in a little later before you talked about it, but I, as someone who spent a lot of time in Catholic schools and among Catholics, the Stations of the Cross is, to me, a truly central part of the celebration of Easter and Good Friday. And I wonder, and when you're talking about the pain of these things, the Stations of the Cross really take you through methodically that process of the difficulty and the pain and the torment. So I wondered if you could talk about how, if this is truly a big tent, I'm making an assumption, like how does that fit with our Unitarian view? How does thinking about the Stations of the Cross help us in any way? Or is it simply, for me, a private, internal kind of religious process?
Can you talk a little about how you experienced that? Was that something where it was set up in a church where there were different stops in each window or something like that?
Yeah. So I would take students through each one. We would be led by a priest, and he would read out each of the stations, and then they would pray along with that. So it took about half an hour, and that was an afternoon spent, well spent, I think.
Have other folks been part of a Stations of the Cross experience? Yeah, some of us. And so my UCC church in California, where I worked for a number of years, we did a Stations of the Cross on Good Friday. I think we just had our church open for 3 hours from 12 to 3, and we had 7 stations set up with imagery and some of the last words of Jesus, and people came in and were kind of invited to meditate. So that's one way to do it. Other ways I've seen is more of an actual kind of church service. Our service on Good Friday, at least the way we've done it for the last few years, you do hear, the last words of Jesus in a similar way. You don't get the movement sense, which is a really great part of the story as well. But in terms of your broader question, in terms of how that fits into the spiritual tent here, I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I would hope that for folks for whom that is a really important part of their story and of the faith, they would bring that here, and that they would feel like it was recognized in something like our Good Friday service. That's always my hope with our big tent, because we talk about that a lot, but then it's really important that the specifics of our different faith backgrounds can be lived out here, and that we're not watering things down so much that we're sort of just at a point of vagueness, if that makes sense.
We've got a comment from our online congregation, and then we'll continue on with some other questions. From Catherine Levin. She says, my experience is that in those times when I feel abandoned by God and I lose my faith, that is like a wildfire burning away the dead wood to allow renewal. It is a necessary experience to building my faith to be stronger and deeper, which is part of the process of finding my faith and reconnecting with God. God doesn't go anywhere. I am the one who abandons God, and when I see only the evil in this world, I believe Christ had to go through this when he was on the cross. Amen. Thank you, Catherine.
So I was brought up in a very Unitarian church where Easter was yay flowers. So I come at it from a very different point of view, which is that the divine has always existed, and that God has delivered his message about how we are supposed to behave many times in many ways. And the story of Jesus and the story of Easter is one of the ways in which it was delivered. And I'm Christian because it's my cultural background, and that's the easiest way for me to receive the message. So to me, whether the resurrection happened or not is sort of irrelevant. It is how the message was delivered. What we're supposed to pay attention to is the message about how we're supposed to behave. And if the resurrection is how, God got everybody's attention in AD 30, like I said, I don't think it matters whether it really happened or not. It's irrelevant, because what the message is how you're supposed to behave. It's not, there's a saying that love is an activity. It's not a feeling, it's an activity. And that's sort of how I feel about, religion and being the kind of person we're called upon to be. It is an activity. And that's the important message of Jesus. Well, anyway, that's my
Reminds me of a saying that, resurrection is a practice, right? It's something that if we are people of the resurrection, it's something that we practice every single day. What does it then mean to practice the resurrection today? Right?
This may not be relevant, but the words that I never understood was Jesus saying, God, why have you forsaken me? And so many of the Christian religions just assume that Jesus is the Son of God. And I guess my question for you is, did Jesus ever really think he was actually the Son of God? Certainly metaphorically, I understand that part. But it follows on what Margaret just said, is that I think this whole, if the divine is really conception and birth, because at least for me, when the kids were born, I realized there's something way beyond me or us. And that is our opportunities when the children are born, both for us and for the children. So, theologically, is there anything in the Bible that really definitively would defend that Jesus is the Son of God? Physically the Son of God?
I mean, I don't know, and curious what you'd say from your Bible perspective. It's great to have Sarah, because she knows the Bible so much better than me. But to get to the first part of your question, well, I'll say first, I think about Jesus's journey in the Gospels as a sort of dawning realization of everything he was called to be and do, which may include dawning realization of his relationship with God. I interviewed this theologian at a bookstore a few months ago, and he is famous for being part of this big argument about this question that you raised, Ken, about how much was Jesus actually abandoned by God, right? His teacher, this German theologian, Jürgen Moltmann, wrote this book, which I love, called The Crucified God, and it really does argue what I was talking about at the beginning, about the crucifixion of Jesus really was abandoned by God. God wasn't there for him in any way. This other guy, Miroslav Volf, says, no, that couldn't be possible, right? If Jesus was the Son of God, he might have felt that God wasn't there, but he couldn't have really been abandoned because, he was God, right? That doesn't make sense. So these arguments continue, and I guess, whether or not that's important to you at all, it's kind of interesting to me. But I think this is part of what the Christian story is. This is part of what a religion is if it's still alive, right? It's these very kinds of disputations and questions about what something means, and then, well, what does it mean for us? So that's a little something for you all to think about. Was Jesus really abandoned by God on the cross, or was it just a temporary feeling? For me, the way that it helps me wrap my own sense of doubt and questioning into the story. So I prefer the Moltmann version in the Crucified God that says, no, Jesus was really abandoned by God at that moment.
And that's the beauty of narrative theology, is what does it then mean to tell the story that way? If you tell the story, Jesus experienced total and utter abandonment. That was his lived experience in that moment. And if you then say that Jesus was divine in some way, what does it mean to tell the story that God experienced divine abandonment and total separation from God's self? What does that do for you? What does that bring up for you if you tell the story that way? What might it mean for us in community to think about suffering and abandonment in that way? How might it open up new doors of compassion and grace for ourselves when we experience that sort of abandonment, or when somebody else asks us questions about how we can go to church because of XYZ that they've gone through? And
failure, too. It's such a story of failure, right? Whether or not you think Jesus really felt that abandonment. I mean, the immense disappointment and sense for Jesus and then all of his followers that, this didn't work, right? And it didn't turn out the way I was expecting, I was hoping. I think there's so many lessons for us in that, right? When we translate that to our contemporary social, political moment, right? So many disappointments, so many senses of why couldn't it have been better? And then, well, what do we do? Do we stop? Do we give up? Or do we continue?
And just quickly on the second part of your question about is there evidence that Jesus thought he was the Son of God? In the Bible, I would say there is evidence that the early church was wrestling with Jesus' identity from the very beginning and didn't agree with itself. So we've got these 4 different narrative stories of the Jesus story, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They tell the same story, but they have different ways of talking about Jesus. These were written 30 to 50 years after the life of Jesus, so none of these are coming from Jesus himself. We don't know what Jesus thought of himself. What we know is that these early Jesus followers told the story about him in such a way that sometimes it seems like he had a sense of himself in a certain way. Sometimes it really seems like he was just a guy who was doing God's will and following what he understood to be God's call on his life. And that's one of the beautiful things that I, love about this narrative theology, is that there's multiple stories and it doesn't always agree, and there's always been room for discussion about who Jesus is in the Jesus movement, and that's good.
I just wanted to say this is the most wonderful thing. I feel like I've waited all my life for this. So thank you. I grew up in a church that, for some reason, I never felt the love of God. I heard about sin and guilt and that I was a bad girl. So I think Buddhism has opened my heart so that I can hear about Christianity. And this is really important to me. And to hear this kind of discussion where it's I don't know, it's just unbelievable to me. And so my question is, could we do this again?
Absolutely, we love to do it. So
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's incumbent on us as this big tent, right, to find ways to get specific and have conversations. So help us think about the best ways to continue these kinds of conversations.
This is best.
Did you have something to say, Adam?
I just had a question
Yeah.
for you.
Let's use the mic.
You said that you prefer the view that God actually did abandon Jesus when he was on the cross. and I'm curious, can you say more about that? Just curious, your more thoughts on that.
Yeah. Adam was asking me to just expand a little bit on why the idea that Jesus was abandoned by God, that God abandoned Jesus, was important to me in my own faith, right? Yeah. I think the experience of God's absence is a real thing. I don't want to like smooth that over or sugarcoat it for people. And I guess it comes partially out of pastoral care and the times I've had speaking to people for whom God really is not there, and how unsuccessful and even condescending it is to try to change their mind in that moment, or even later on. So I want that feeling. I guess it is a feeling. It's a reality in so much as any feeling is real. I want that to be part of the story. I want that to be included, as opposed to saying, well, someone who feels like that has to be outside the circle of our story. To me, on Good Friday, no, that's what happens on Good Friday. And so to have that be so central to our story, I guess that opens it up. That brings more experiences in.
Very bad things happen to people for no particular reason.
Very bad things happen. Absolutely true. Yeah.
I just wanted to add another thought, because I think that's an intriguing question. And Nate, thank you for the sharing about that. I wanted to add another perspective. I was raised Roman Catholic, cycled out of that in my 20s, was sort of a religious nomad for a while, and found the UU Church in my 30s and 40s. But I always think that moment of Jesus on the cross right before death, saying in such a heartfelt, vulnerable way, my God, why have you abandoned me? I always thought, my own personal interpretation was this was a final gift to humanity. I always interpreted it wasn't that God abandoned Jesus. It really raised up how hard it is for the human and the divine to connect, and that even Jesus, in the divine and human form, at this moment of deep vulnerability right before death, couldn't do it. And I always felt that it was like this final gift to us of how hard this is. It wasn't that God had abandoned Jesus, it's how hard it is for us in human form to connect with that divinity, and that, to connect with that deep, deep sense of love when we're in suffering. Because the suffering it's a hard thing to wade through. It's a hard thing to deal with when we're trying to connect with that level of divinity. And so I always saw this as, this moment that, was sort of raised up. It was even hard for Jesus. So I always thought this was like a parting gift, is always how I interpreted it. And I also want to say, in the piece about resurrection, coming back to Sarah's point about the Trinitarian view, I also agree with that. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Like I always perceive the Holy Spirit as the thing that should be talked about more on Easter Sunday, because it was sort of the releasing of the love. It was the releasing of the light. It was the releasing of the Spirit, and that was really the thing that lives. And so when I think about resurrection, not as a noun but as a verb, Holy Spirit has to be part of that conversation, at least for me. So anyway, I just wanted to add that thought.
Thank you, Carol. Maybe we should have another one of these conversations around Pentecost.
Yeah, exactly.
Get some Holy Spirit going in here.
Just want to do a change. Talk to me about Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism. what is it all about? Do you know?
We should schedule another
Yeah,
forum of
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
conversation.
I know
That's
we're
a-
past
that's a big one.
12:30, but it is crazy to me to just be living in a country where so many people value the same general story that I value and take it in a completely different and I would say damaging direction. It's confusing. Sometimes in my less generous moments, I don't believe that a lot of those people believe what they say, or I wonder how they could identify as Christian. It feels like it's simply just a sort of political marker, right? And I think there's certain leaders for whom that's clearly true. Then again, I find it so helpful to remember the story that we told today, right? Which involves the military, which involves religion, and involves the people in power and the leaders of a religious community selling their souls, making wrong decisions. And that is a story that's repeated over and over and over again. And ironically, we're living that out with Christianity.
Yeah, Christian nationalism is the belief that the Jesus parade needed to actually be on the other side, and the Jesus movement needed to be at the other parade. That's where the real power is. That's what Christian nationalism is. Yeah, it's a return to Caesar as Lord.
That's beautiful to say. I mean, horrible, but perfect.
Much more to say about all of this, but thank you all for being
Thanks,
here.
everybody. Yeah.
Let us know if there's more questions.